The power and scope of government is increasingly encroaching into all of our lives, punishing people for peaceful activities that should have never been criminalized in the first place. But the people actually have a very powerful tool at their disposal. And it's how a man guilty of cannabis charges went free in Georgia last year, and why a man who showed compassion for his fellow human beings was not convicted recently. It's called jury nullification, and its roots in America go back to before the Revolution. According to the Fully Informed Jury Association, jury nullification is when a jury returns a not guilty verdict even though jurors believe beyond reasonable doubt that the defendant has broken the law. And there's a reason you probably haven't heard about it, because it allows you to undermine the government's authority. Though in 1895, the Supreme Court decided that defendants have no right for juries to be informed of their right to nullify, 25 years later, it ruled jurors could still do so. This paradox means that today, even though jurors have this right, courts warn them that they are to determine innocence or guilt whether or not they agree with the legitimacy and morality of the law in question. In short, the government and its dictates are not to be questioned. Despite government's fetish for control, laws are not always moral. We've seen this around the world in the most extreme cases of authoritarianism, and we've also seen it in American history, where jury nullification has played a crucial role in protecting freedom and undermining unjust laws. It was first recognized by English courts in 1670, and colonists often used it to protest parliamentary actions. In 1735, jurors used nullification when they refused to convict a man who was charged with seditious libel for publishing articles criticizing the governor of New York. Shortly after the establishment of the U.S. government, James Madison passed the Alien and Sedition Acts in an attempt to crack down on immigrants and stifle criticism of the state, and some juries declined to find violators guilty. When the government imposed the Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed for the capture of runaway slaves as well as the punishment of anyone who interfered in that process, juries refused to convict. When the government attempted to ban alcohol, juries nullified the completely misguided and violative law. During the Vietnam War, an unconstitutional war based on a lie, juries chose not to convict protesters who destroyed draft cards while exercising their First Amendment rights. Despite this rich history, very few people know about jury nullification. But if the government truly cared about the people it claims to serve and represent, and truly wanted a limit on its own power, wouldn't it encourage jurors to apply their own consciences in order to prevent abuses by the state, which is historically far more guilty of injustice and inflicting harm on innocents, often under protection of the law, than any one individual tried in a courtroom ever could? Rather than fully informing jurors of their rights, however, courts instead insist jurors must focus only on whether or not the person did it, not whether they should be criminalized for it, even if said criminal act didn't hurt anyone or their property. So for example, my dad was once dismissed from jury duty because he expressed that he didn't think it was the government's right to criminalize prostitution, and because it was a prostitution case, he was of no use to the court because he didn't recognize the government's authority. In 1997, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit categorically rejected the practice. Further, Doug O. Linder, a professor at University of Missouri, Kansas City Law School, has explained that some judges have argued that informing jurors of their power to nullify places too much weight on their shoulders, that it is easier on jurors to simply decide facts, not the complex issues that may be presented in decisions about the morality or appropriateness of laws. In other words, some judges think people are too stupid to evaluate the legitimacy and morality of laws, but according to the basics of democracy, they're somehow smart enough to elect the right people to make those laws. Governments also often ban citizens from informing jurors of their rights, punishing activists and calling it criminal tampering when, in fact, the government actively attempting to keep information from jurors seems far more like tampering than letting people know their rights. Jury nullification is obviously not the thing to do when an actual crime has been committed against a person or their property, but it is a potent way of standing up to the state when it's wrong. Can it work though? The chances of ending up on a jury are slim enough, let alone ending up on a trial where jury nullification can actually be applied. However, it can certainly help individuals like the Georgia man growing a plant for his pain or the Arizona man who dared give water to migrants. And that makes a difference not only for them, but also in chipping away at a corrupt and seemingly monolithic state power. As the Fully Informed Jury Association notes, when these kinds of rejections of enforcement of laws stack up over time, the laws become unenforceable. We've seen this rejection of the fugitive slave laws and alcohol prohibition, for example, undermine such laws' enforcement. Eventually, it is no longer worth the time or hassle or embarrassment for government officials to try to enforce these laws. They may be further nullified in a sense, either remaining on the books but not being enforced or being repealed altogether. Nullification is especially useful in federal cases, which require unanimous jury decisions, meaning a single person can engage in a practice and overturn a conviction. Even if you personally never get to engage in jury nullification, it's empowering to know that you're not inescapably bound to the government's authority, and that in fact, that authority is quite fallible, and that you can educate others about this right. Just don't do it when you're actually sitting on a jury. Courts have ruled that you can be removed for considering nullification, and an authority-worshipping fellow juror might tattle on you and get you kicked off. And that is the biggest obstacle to this dissent tactic, which is something I learned the last time I had jury duty. So there was this potential juror who was being interviewed by the prosecution, and he expressed honestly that he didn't think he could be impartial to a cop's testimony. Why? Because he had some malice toward police because he had once gotten a ticket for jaywalking. The entire courtroom busted out laughing. It didn't occur to them that perhaps an individual is capable of crossing the street without going to a government-sanctioned crosswalk because he could look left and right, and he could make a decision for himself without harming anyone else. Yet people could not grasp this, and they felt without question that there was no reason he shouldn't be given a ticket, and they thought that it was hilarious that he might have an objection to it. Before we can truly fight back against an ever-encroaching state violating our rights, we have to change our relationship to authority. Despite the endless historical examples of the pitfalls and destruction obedience to government causes, many Americans enthusiastically bow down, reciting statements like he should have just followed the law, and insisting police aren't responsible for violating the rights of others because they were just enforcing the government's rules. In fact, many Americans are so drunk on authority that they don't even care when those in power break the law, and in fact, seek to give them more power. Yet even Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Sonia Sotomayor, whose position embodies power and authority, has acknowledged why it matters.
You know, the Second Circuit has an opinion that basically says that juries should never be instructed about jury nullification, and that any instruction that would suggest it is wrong. I hewed very closely to the Second Circuit line for many, many years. As I've grown more in the system and watching it, I'm not so sure that that's right. Think about what juries did during the civil rights movement. If it weren't for jury nullification, we would have many civil rights individuals who would be convicted felons or otherwise for things that today we think are protected by the First Amendment. There is a place, I think, for jury nullification, finding the balance of that and the role that a judge should or should not play in advising juries about that is, I think, a different thing.
When a government repeatedly violates its own supreme laws, yet claims a moral right to punish others for violating many of their own unconstitutional anti-freedom dictates, jury nullification and our right to engage in it is vital, and you can learn more at fija.org.